Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. All right, so I don't think you guys can be able to hear it, but I'll play it for the viewers, and then we'll just go from there. Bismillah.
Scientific error number 1. Surah 86 verses or ayahs 5 to 7. Let the people consider that they were what they were created from. They were created from a spurting fluid stemming from between the backbone and the rib cage. Now, there are dozens of scientific errors in the Quran. I just picked 4 of what I found to be the funniest ones. This one is hilarious. So the Quran is saying that sperm originates from between the backbone and the ribs, the rib cage. This is that area right there. For those of you who can't see, that's a smaller image right there. This is where it supposes that sperm originates. Now, we know biology says that your sperm comes from where? Your testicles. If you were to remove your testicles, you will no longer be able to produce sperm. It ain't got nothing to do with what's going on up here. Can we all agree that this is the rib cage, and this long thing coming from the neck all the way down to the top of the pelvis is the backbone? And so what is in between these two things? If you were to draw a cross section, y'all remember doing Venn diagrams in math class? It would be somewhere around this area, somewhere around the lungs, heart, air.
All right. So initially, and I hope everyone can still hear us, I think there was a little bit of lag, but hopefully it's good. Regardless, inshallah, after the stream, we'll get it dealt with. So he uses the argument that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is what Don claims, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, that basically sperm is created from between the backbones and the ribs. So, Sheikh, is that what Allah says in the Qur'an? And what is the Muslim response to this?
Okay, good. So I've done a formal presentation, but I'll have to skip all of these slides just to go to the responses, because in the beginning I talk about the Quran, the philosophy of science, and...
You think that's better if we cover that first?
Well, we can, but since he's raised this, let me just address this, and then we could go from the beginning maybe, yeah?
And we'll come back to the points one by one too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, where are we? Okay.
All right, while you're finding it, Sheikh, everyone in the comments is saying Fareed responds, sent us. So shout out to Fareed responds. May Allah bless you, Akhi. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for sending viewers here.
Fareed is the Don. He is the Don. That's all I have to say.
Also, Ali Shabar donated $125. Thumbs up, guys. Let's enjoy what our friends have to say. Allahumma ameen. Jazakallah khair, brother Ali. May Allah bless you. All right, Sheikh, take it away. Bismillah.
Good. So, by the way, we have a thing with the 3 Muslims. I told them I'm not a sheikh, which is obviously true, but they say it's a way of it's a
term of endearment,
bro.
An expression of endearment. Yeah. So now henceforth I'm going to be called the protein sheikh.
Protein sheikh, not actual sheikh.
I had my protein ice cream just a few minutes ago, about half an hour ago. Anyway, so chapter 86 verses 5 to 7. And this is about the error of where sperm comes from. Now, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran in chapter 86, verses 5 to 7, man should reflect on what he was created from. He is created from a spurting fluid, then he emerges from between the backbone and the breastbone. And this is the summary of the contention. The Quran says that the sperm comes from between the backbone and the ribs. This is unscientific. The sperm comes from the testes or the testicles, which is not between the backbone and the ribs. Okay, now before I get into them, just fix my light. I do apologize. Need to lift this thing. There you go. Okay, so that's the contention. Now, there are various ways of answering this contention, but before I get into the answers, the scientific errors narrative. So people who say that there are errors in the Quran, scientific errors in the Quran, for them to show that the Quran is wrong, they would have to show either the opinion that they think or the view that they think the Quran is talking about is the only interpretation, and that interpretation goes against established science. Or what they should do is that all the valid different interpretations, all of them go against established science. In order for the scientific errors narrative to actually have any strength, they have to do that. And it's impossible because they would have to assume there's only one view, and that view is the view that they think the Qur'an is talking about, and they think that view is actually going against established science, and that is never the case with these accusations. Or what they could try and do, that they may agree and say, fine, there are many interpretations, many views of what these words can mean, and each interpretation of the words or the verses, or the verse, the different interpretations, they are all unscientific and they all go against established science. And again, that's even that's highly unlikely, more unlikely than the first option, because you have more views now, right? More different interpretations, and many of them are most likely to be accurate, or at least in line with a naked eye understanding of reality. So they can't. It's very, very difficult for the scientific errors in the Quran narrative to actually hold any weight because of what I've just said. So it's very important to mention this. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's very important that they may find scholars of the past, or even maybe of the present, that they may have interpretations that go against established fact or established empirical reality or established science. That's not a problem. We're not denying the fact that we have a rich tradition over 1,000 years, and thousands of scholars had different views based within a valid hermeneutical framework, a valid exegetical framework, right? So we accept that. There could be views from certain scholars that thought that a verse meant something, and what they thought it meant goes against established science today. That's not a problem. It would only be a problem for us if that scholar's view was the only view and the only valid view, and that view actually goes against established science. But that's not the case, and that's why it's very important for us to mention this from the beginning. So, there's various answers to deal with this contention. Answer number one: first and foremost, we have to understand the Quran does not mention the word for sperm, or any word that can connote sperm, that can mean sperm. For example, Allah uses the word nutfat or nutfa in the Quran, which refers to a minute drop of fluid. So if you go to the dictionaries like Lisan al-Arab and many other classical dictionaries, a nutfa is a really small, minute drop of fluid, okay? And that is more in line with if anyone were to, refer to the term sperm in the Quran, that this word would be more in line with that. But the Quran doesn't use that at all. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses in these verses 86 to 5 to 7, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word for water or fluid. Right? So Allah used the word ma, for example, which means fluid or water. So the conclusion we can make here is that the Quran does not use the word sperm in these verses, and therefore the first part of the contention is totally misplaced. However, and I should have mentioned this in the preliminary video, that even if it did refer to sperm, it would still not be inaccurate. Because as you would see, and we're going to discuss this in a few moments, the term sulb can also mean loins, not just backbone. And the testes are actually between the loins and the ribs. At-tara'ib, right? So if you view sulb to mean the loins, the testicles are between. The definition of the loins is like whatever is just from the pelvic arch, I think, and above, or the area where your underpants. You put underpants on, right? Or I don't know what you call it in North America. I don't know. You call it something else, but because pants for you guys is trousers. So what's underpants?
What, like underwear?
Yeah, there you go. Underwear. So your underwear, or the traditional, briefs, whatever you call it, that is your loin area, right? So if you take the valid classical meaning for the term sulb, not only to mean backbone, but to mean loins, then the testicles are between the loins and the ribs. Simple as that. So even if his false understanding of this verse were true, in this case that the Quran is talking about sperm here, it would still be true. It wouldn't go against established science, because the testes are in the loin area. When you put your briefs on or your underwear on, you're covering the loin area, and that area if you imagine that area, and above it is obviously the rib cage. So between that is, lo and behold, the place where sperm is produced, which are the testes. So I wanted to put that in there just to show that even if his false understanding of the meaning of the word was true, his contention is still false. Okay? So the second answer is, well, before we get into the second answer, let's unpack some of the key words that the Qur'an uses that are relevant to our discussion today. So Allah mentions yakhruju, which the root for that is kharaja. So the meaning, the classical meaning for this word is to exit, to issue, to emerge, to come out, and to leave. And this is used in various places in the Qur'an. In chapter 30, verse 25, chapter 23, verse 20, chapter 5, 22. And this is very important to know. This is what the word means, okay? Now, as-sulbi, the root is sad, lam, and ba. And the classical meaning is loins or backbone. Now, what's very interesting, the root can also mean to become hard or rigid. That's the root. But the word itself means loins or backbone. At-tara'ib comes from the root ta, ra, ba, and it means collarbone, upper chest, or ribs. And so this is very interesting for us to know the many layers of valid meaning in the classical dictionaries, okay? Now, there are many views of the Quranic exegetes, scholars, and three of them include the following. Number one, it refers to a gushing fluid exiting from between the backbone or loins and the rib. For example, this is the view of Ibn Kathir and many others. In actual fact, one would argue most of the scholars had this view. The other view is that it refers to the baby coming out of the womb, okay? And this is a view that Al-Qurtubi, the classical scholar, who predates this kind of scientific understanding, if you like, and even Ibn Atiyya, he had very similar views. Their views specifically were that there is, within the rules of Quranic exegesis and usul tafsir, the principle of Quranic exegesis, using the language and so on and so forth, that the verse allows the meaning that this refers to the baby coming out of the womb. And we know the womb is between the ribs and the backbone. And by the way, the backbone in the Arabic language includes the tailbone. And obviously the word itself, sulb, also means not just the backbone, but the loins. It could be the loins and the ribs. And we know the womb is in between that, and obviously this is the understanding of the modern scholar, Professor Abdul Halim from SOAS University of London. The third view is that, well, these two words, as-sulbi and at-tara'ib, these are kinayas, if you like. It's a kinaya. It's a linguistic indicator for something. So, and this is not the view of Al-Maturidi, which I mentioned in the previous preliminary video. Although it's mentioned in his tafsir, he cites someone, he cites an authority. So just to be a bit nuanced, So Al-Maturidi, he cites an authority, and he says as-sulbi is a linguistic indicator for the male, and at-tara'ib is a linguistic indicator for the female. All right. So what is sulbi? Sulb is the loins or the backbone, right? The backbone. And remember, the linguistic indicator or the root for the word sulb also means to become hard or rigid, which is an interesting inference that you may want to make. So sulb is the linguistic indicator for male, and at-tara'ib is the linguistic indicator for the female. So the backbone and the ribs, right? The backbone and the ribs. So therefore it could refer to sexual intercourse, and when the male ejaculates, this is between the male, backbone, and the female, the ribs, because ribs is an indicator, a kinaya for female, and backbone, in this case, sulb is a kinaya, is a linguistic indicator for the male. So and it's between those two entities, if you like, that the gushing fluid, happens, right? Because of the sexual union between the male and the female. So this is like what word can we use? It's like a rhetorical way of indicating the sexual union and what happens, right? So that's another view in our classical tradition. I'm not saying you have to accept that view, but it is a view. And it's actually allowed within the language itself, because Al-Maturidi, he when he cites this authority, it also cites another verse that actually contributes to this understanding. So the point here is there's three main views. It is the fluid, and it comes from the backbone or loins and the rib, between those two things. Number two is the baby that comes out of the womb. And finally, number three, it is that sulb is a kinaya, is an indicator for male, and at-tara'ib is a linguistic indicator for female. So this could indicate the sexual union between the two, and obviously the ejaculatory fluid happens as a result, and it's between those two entities, yeah? So that's the summary of those three views. So since those three views exist, well, let's discuss them in detail. And when we see these views and we try to correlate it to an established scientific perspective, we see that there's nothing that is of error. There's nothing that goes against established science. So let's take the gushing fluid as an example. So as we said, the meaning here can mean that the gushing fluid exits or is issued between the backbone and the ribs, or even the loins and the ribs, because remember, sulb can mean backbone or loins and the ribs. And if you think about it, the science says that 70 to 85%, which is the majority of the ejaculatory fluid that contains sperm, comes from the seminal vesicles, right? And the seminal vesicles are between the backbone or loins and the ribs. And remember, the backbone in Arabic language includes the tailbone of the coccyx. So you can see this picture here, where the tailbone is. You see, I don't know if you can see my arrow here, you have the seminal vesicle, and this is the tailbone, right? And above, you have the ribs and the collarbone. So between this area, within this area, is actually the seminal vesicles, which are responsible for the majority of the gushing fluid, right? Now, this is very interesting. This is very interesting. Now, even if you don't accept this view, well, the other linguistic meaning for sulb can mean loins, which is this whole area here. And it's true, this whole area and is the loins, and above it is the ribs, and between it you have the seminal vesicles, which produces 70 to 85% of the ejaculatory fluid that contains sperm. Because the sperm is created in the testes, then it basically travels up. I think it travels up this thing called it's the deferens duct, or it's called the vas deferens. That's the one, yeah? And so when you see it from a linguistic perspective, which is a valid meaning in the classical tradition, and it's within the hermeneutical classical framework, no problem. It's true that the gushing fluid comes from between the backbone and the ribs, or specifically the loins and the ribs. And what's between the loins and the ribs? The vesicle, the seminal vesicles, which are responsible for most of the ejaculatory fluid. Now, you don't have to accept this view, but even if you were to accept this view, then it doesn't go against established science. Now, please note that the reason many scholars held that it is gushing fluid that emerges from between the loins or the backbone and the ribs is because of a grammatical linguistic rule. And the linguistic rule, it's a general rule, is that the pronoun refers to the closest preceding noun. However, we have to understand that this is not universally applied in the Qur'an, okay? But this is one of the reasons why that was a majority view. But it's not the only view. And we see, but before we go to the second view, I've given you a few more diagrams here for you to see. So you have the rib cage here, as you can see, the blue line, and you have the end of the backbone area, because as you know, linguistically in Arabic, the backbone also includes the tailbone. And And this is the loin area as well. So that's another line, because remember, sulb can also mean not only backbone, but the loin area. And between these two areas, you have the seminal vesicle. It's this thing in green, if you can see. Okay, the thing in green. Also, if you want to have a close-up, again, you see the seminal vesicle here in green, and you have the vas deferens, which takes the sperm from the testes, and I think it goes to the seminal vesicles. And basically you have your full-blown ejaculatory fluid, and most of that comes from the seminal vesicle, which is around 70 to 85% of the ejaculatory fluid. And as you can see, this is the loin area. And remember, the word sulb can mean backbone, and the backbone does include the tailbone as well, but it also can mean, sulb can also mean the loin area, and above is the rib. And it's true that the fluid is emitted from between the loin or backbone and the ribs. So linguistically and scientifically, it's not a problem at all. So going to the second opinion, the second opinion is that it's actually the baby that comes from between the loin area. As you can see, here is the loin area, and up here is the ribs. And this is like this is not the ribs, it's the sternum. I think it's called the sternum, yeah? But the ribs are around here. So you have the loin area and the ribs, and the baby emerges from this area. So it's not a problem at all. So sulb can mean backbone and loin area, and at-tara'ib can mean rib or rib cage, and it's right here. And between this is the baby, and it emerges from this area, right? Emerges from that area. So this was the view of Abd al-Halim, and this is something that Al-Qurtubi, classical scholar, and Ibn Atiyya, a classical scholar, actually indicate strongly that this is a valid view that can be held because the language allows it and the rules of tafsir, of exegesis, allow it too. So, and one of the reasons why Abd al-Halim also talks about this is because he argues that it makes more sense with the kind of imagery and the theme of the chapter that these verses are in. And this this main theme is about resurrection. So, Allah talks about that man should reflect from where he came from. He came from a fluid, right? A gushing fluid. And then instead of saying that it's this fluid that emerges, but rather what Abd al-Halim says is this should refer to the insan, to the human being. It's the human being that emerges from between the loin area, backbone area, and the ribs. And then after, there's going to be resurrection. So it makes sense from a kind of chronological, thematical perspective that you started as fluid, then you became a baby, then you emerged, and then you're going to die, and you're going to emerge again, and you're going to be resurrected, right? So Abd al-Halim actually felt that this was more in line with the conciseness and the rhetorical nature of this chapter. So this is another valid view. The other view is, as we mentioned, is basically sexual intercourse. And this was a view that Al-Maturidi talks about. He doesn't develop the view himself, but he cites an authority. And basically the argument is that as-sulb is a linguistic indicator, it's a kinaya for a male. At-tara'ib is a kinaya, it's a linguistic indicator for a female. So therefore those two things are between those two things is where the ejaculation happens, right? And this is maybe a rhetorical and ethical or linguistic, has linguistic etiquette, right? The way to express the sexual activity in the Quranic text, which is and you have these nuances in the Quran, when Allah talks about when you touching a female, right? And many of the ulama felt that this wasn't literally touching with your hand, but this was actually intercourse itself. So this is another indicator. You have things in the Quran like to free a neck. To free a neck doesn't mean you just free the neck on its own. The apparent meaning is quite obvious, because what that means is it's a kinaya, it's an indicator for the whole human being. In this context, it's a slave. So to free a slave, right? So this could be somewhat similar, not 100% identical, but it's a kinaya, it's a linguistic indicator. So as-sulb is backbone, but that is an indicator for the male. At-tara'ib is a linguistic indicator, it's a kinaya for a female, and it's between those two entities where the gushing fluid happens, as a result of sexual intercourse. That's another view. You don't have to accept that view, but if you were to take that view, which is a valid view, it doesn't go against scientific consensus or any kind of established science. So we have a conclusion here. The three valid interpretations do not contain scientific errors. Simple as that. And I'm shocked that this exists online. And, there's no excuse anymore, because people need to be a little bit more sincere and robust, right? Because we have very good academic works in the English language. For example, what I've deliberately done for many of these things, although we do have Arabic references too, I've used an Quranic classical Arabic dictionary that is in the English language. And it's about Quranic usage, and I'll give you the full title at the end. And it's a phenomenal dictionary. You look at the root word, you see the meanings of the root word, and you see the different forms of the root word in the Quranic usage. And it's really, it's an amazing book, an amazing dictionary, an amazing resource. And even you have things like Lane's Lexicon, which is in English as well. And that is accessible online. And you could look into these things for yourself. You even have exegetical works in English that are available. Al-Qurtubi is available now. Maybe not all of it, but a lot of it. You have Ibn Kathir, albeit a summarized version. But there's no excuse anymore. There's enough out there for you to do your research and not to just, cite Islamophobes and cite YouTubers and cite people who don't have, an in-depth understanding of the religion, or at least a kind of decent understanding of the religion and the Quranic text and the Quranic discourse and usul tafsir and the principles of exegesis and hermeneutics. These things are, and by the way, just because I'm talking about this doesn't make me an expert. I'm talking about this, and it goes to show how not of an expert you need to be even to understand these basic things. Because I'm not an expert. I'm not qualified to do exegesis. But can I access dictionaries? Yes. Can I understand them? Yes. Can I understand the verse and maybe dissect it? Yes, for most of them. So, but that requires a very basic level, right? So from that perspective, there's no excuse. People should go and check things out for themselves. So this contention is thoroughly debunked in my view. And look, and it's very, and people have, I know you guys have had criticisms of why you've been speaking about this gentleman, yeah? But I think people misunderstand that it's not really about him, right? Because he has, nearly 3 million followers. It's about the impact that ignorance can make. I used to say this a lot, it takes, say you have a toddler, a child, it's 2 years old, and you're nappy training, diaper training, and they happen to excrete. They literally do a poo all over the carpet floor in your living room. How long does it take them to do a poo on the carpet in the living room? It will take them about 5 minutes max, yeah? Maybe less. How long does it take you to clean it up? 5 hours at least. So you can have someone who's ignorant about the Islamic tradition or not bother to go a little bit deeper to understand it. They may have a lot of followers, and they literally do a poo on the internet. they excrete all over the internet. And, it takes ages sometimes to contact all the individuals that have been affected, because we live in a really ridiculous world that people just follow influencers. So, I wanted to mention this because I didn't want people to point fingers at you that you think that, that you're dealing with someone that's not worth dealing with. No. It's not about the person, really. May Allah guide him. It would be good to have a conversation with him one day. You could give him my number. We could have a chat, and we could really connect and understand his context or where he's coming from, and trying to, help him, to get the optimal version of him. And maybe he could do that with me too. And then I think in the end, it will be beneficial for both parties. We should give him dawah, because this is a true sign of a believer, that you love for others what you love for yourself. And from the perspective of giving dawah and to non-Muslims, is that you want goodness for them, you want guidance for them. Yeah, this is something that An-Nawawi speaks about, the classical scholar, and even Maliki, I think he was a Maliki scholar, Ibn Taqiq al-Eid. So Muslims should have this overwhelming mercy, and they have this loving kindness for people because they want them to have goodness and guidance. Yeah. In other words, we should be committed to people's well-being. So that should happen. But he's got influence. If you've got like 3 million subs, and you make a mess all over the carpet floor, from a metaphorical perspective, it would take a long time to clean up. And that's why we have to produce things like this, because it has other objectives, right? I thought I'd just mention that. But anyway, any questions, guys? Any points that you want to improve on, add, anything?
So I just want to quickly summarize what I...
Your microphone, bro.
Yeah, your mic.
Is it low?
I think it's switched up.
Okay, how about now?
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so before there was an echo, so I had to play with my mic settings and mute it, so that stopped. So Jazakallah khair for the people that called that out. That was my fault. So I just want to kind of elaborate or summarize what I gathered from your explanation of these verses. So firstly, I want to go back to the verses themselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, "Let people then consider what they were created from a spurting fluid stemming from between the backbone and the rib cage." So firstly, that fluid itself doesn't necessarily mean sperm, but everything that is that spurts out during climax for a man, and that is not just sperm itself, but fluid that comes from the seminal vesicle. So if you were to interpret stemming from between the backbone and the rib cage as being the man's backbone and the man's rib cage, then that interpretation would be valid and scientifically accurate as well. Is that correct?
Yes, because the seminal vesicles are between that area, and they produce around 70 to 85% of the ejaculatory fluid.
Perfect. And then
Now, some people may be very specific. They may be like, oh, but the backbone is not really, the ribs are not really between the backbone. The seminal vesicles are not really between the backbone and the ribs. Because if you make a line between the tailbone, which in Arabic includes the backbone, right, in terms of the meaning, and which is right next to or parallel to the seminal vesicles, if you draw a line right up, it won't hit the rib cage. It will go out of his belly. So they'll be like, oh, it's not really between. And I find that really stupid, because it's like saying, just because my head is not literally in between my shoulders, we can't say my head is not between my shoulders. It is between my shoulders. It's not literally between my shoulders, because this is my head, my shoulders are here, right? So if you draw a line, the between my shoulders is my collarbone. It's not my head. But we have the saying, your head is between your shoulders, right? Now, so that's how you can respond to that view. Or the way to respond it is, well, as-sulb doesn't only mean backbone, it also means loins. And that now you have a greater area. You have the area where whatever you put your briefs on or your underwear on, that's the loin area. And between that and the breastbone or the ribs is actually the seminal vesicles and everything else that is necessary in order for you to, in order for the ejaculatory fluid to exit from the body.
Okay, perfect. Jazakallah khair. And just to reiterate for the viewers, if my mic's still low, just let me know. I'm playing around with it, inshallah. I'm going to try and keep myself muted so there's no echo. So that is if the backbone in the ribs refers to the backbone of the man and the ribs of the woman. So next, if you take the approach that it's the backbone of the man and the ribs of the woman, then that would also be an accurate interpretation according to the Qur'an and according to science, because it would be referring to, kind of conception and intercourse itself in the act of it. And that is a valid interpretation that some classical scholars have had. And then the third interpretation would be that it's referring to the...
Well, that was the third interpretation.
Oh.
So in terms of the chronology of what I was speaking about.
Yes.
But so al-sulbi is a linguistic indicator for the male. It means backbone, but it's an indicator for the male. And al-tara'ib is a linguistic indicator for the female.
Yeah.
So, and that means rib cage. But if you even see them as a backbone and a rib cage, right? And the backbone is the male and the rib cage is the female, then in between that is basically what happens, and you have the ejaculatory fluid as a result of sexual intercourse. Now, the third view that you were going to mention, which is the second view,
Yes.
this was about the baby emerging between the backbone and the ribs, and this refers to the backbone and the ribs of the woman. See, which is one of the valid views in the Islamic tradition. So it could mean the backbone of the woman and the ribs of the woman, or the loins of the woman and the ribs of the woman, and that's where the womb is, and the baby emerges from the womb. Make sense?
100%. And I think that
And and what's very important for people to understand, we're not making this stuff up, yeah? We're not like trying to do linguistic gymnastics. This is based on classical scholars that did not have the internet and did not meet people that had these ridiculous contentions, yeah? So this predates the kind of discourse on scientific errors, yeah? And this is why it's very important to highlight that, because we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Our classical tradition have given us all of these answers, which is amazing, yeah? And that's why Al-Qurtubi, classical scholar, Ibn Atiyah, they said that it's linguistically sound to think that this is the baby coming out of the womb, and the womb is between the backbone or the loins and the ribs of the woman. And this is perfectly fine within the rules of the classical Arabic language, within the rules of tafsir, exegesis, and it's one of the valid interpretations and meanings.
100%. So it kind of seems like, to make the argument that this verse is scientifically inaccurate, you would have to first misrepresent what is being stated, and and maybe even in some cases misrepresent what the standard narrative in science is at the same time. So I think
yes, and if you want to claim the Quran is inaccurate in this case, you have to show that all the possible interpretations and valid meanings of this verse and these words are actually go against established science. And we've given you just three. I think there are more. Three of them clearly show that they're not against established science. Therefore, your contention is baseless.
100%. All right, so I'm gonna put a brief pause for the viewers here, and I'm going to go through.
Maybe, you know what? Maybe we should just do all of them, and then we could talk about principles. It might be better now, because if we go back and we go through the whole presentation about principles, the epistemic goals of the Quran, the timeless nature of the Quran, and then come back to this, I think it would be a lot. It would be quite heavy. Maybe we should just cover all of his issues, all of the responses to the issues. Then we go and we could, if we have time, we could go through the
guys,
rest.
We're gonna be back in like 20 to 30 seconds, guys.
Gonna put a short break.
Yeah.
All right. Jazakallah khair for everyone who sent the super chats, and also just for you guys' knowledge, the laptop speakers, I can't turn them down because I have a specific plugin, and sometimes when my mic is unmuted, it'll pick up the sound from my laptop. So when the brothers are talking, you'll hear it through my mic. So I just have